Well, I think we're all set. We're going to begin. So, thanks again, everyone, for being here today. This is our last of the Curators virtual and in-person talks about Americana collections, and which are so much a part of the researchers' feast here in the Mercantile. And we've looked over the fall at objects and art archives and diaries and women who were prominent at the Mercantile. And full circle now, we're back to one of our most important scrapbook collections, John Barriger's mid-century and 1930s era photographs of literally the entire railroading infrastructure of his day here in this country. And Nick Fry, the Robert McKnight Curator of Rail History in the Barriger collection, has been at the Mercantile now for 10 years, and in his time has published and spoken widely and made this great rail collection his own, stamping it with his knowledge and with deep historical insight and gracious humor and wit. And all of us have been enlightened many times over by his enthusiasm for his subject and his expertise in American railroad history. Nick is currently writing a 200th anniversary volume on the beginning of railroads in America, and for an exhibition that he's curating at the Distinguished Scrollier Club in New York City. That's coming on in April, and we're all looking forward to that. But today we have a chance to look at a collection of 50,000 images, which 40 years ago forged the beginning of the largest railroad historical collection in America here at the Mercantile, the Barriger collection. So Nick, take it away. Please welcome.
So today we're going to be talking about scrapbooks, and it's kind of a challenge to talk about scrapbooks for a virtual presentation. And I hope everyone's going to be able to enjoy the flavor of it. But in the meantime, we do have most of the images available online. When I came here 10 years ago, this was and still is a dream job for any railroad fanatic. And I guess I have to count myself as a railroad fanatic, because the first few weeks of work, I spent a goodly part of the day when I should have been going home and sleeping, looking at the scrapbooks. This was something that I didn't know about until I got a chance to interview here and meet John and Chris and everybody and Charlie, and they showed me the scrapbooks. And being from Maryland, my first question was, is my favorite railroad in there? And honestly, whenever anybody from across the country comes in, they ask, is my favorite railroad in here? And I can generally say, probably. It is one of the most comprehensive photographic documentations of the U.S. railroad network on the eve of World War II. And so how it came to be is kind of an adventure unto itself. I'm going to go and pop around on our webpage here from the Barriger collection. And I'm going to see if this may help folks. Okay. So John Barriger was born in St. Louis, and his father had worked for the Cotton Belt before his untimely death in his office. And he wound up going to MIT. And MIT in the 19-teens had a very strong railroad engineering program. Still has a very strong civil engineering program, but at the time, the industry was railroading. That was the aerospace industry, that was rocketry, that was SpaceX and NASA and the Air Force. That was what you wanted to go into. And a co-op program there brought Barriger to the Pennsylvania Railroad for his summers and winters away from class. And he took his camera with him. And he was a bright young man doing management training. They were pretty much going to offer him a job right out of school. But in the course of his co-op program for 2 years, during World War I, which honestly, if you want to see a lot of trains run, that's a good time to do it, particularly on the Pennsylvania Railroad. He took his camera with him and he documented what he saw. Now, Barriger is not what we call a foamer. A foamer is someone who is really enthusiastic about trains, and excuse me, and in many cases brings a camera with them, and they're focused on the equipment. Barriger is in the most case focused on the infrastructure because he's in a civil engineering program. This is going to be a trend that follows these scrapbooks and Barriger's photography throughout his career. The locomotive, the train he's on is nice, and in some cases technically interesting to him. But it's the engineering, the right-of-way, the infrastructure that keeps the trains running is what he focuses on, which is great because it's the complete opposite of what everybody else focuses on when they take their train trackside. That's me included. I don't take pictures of the track. I'm looking for the train. And this is one of his earliest pictures in the 20s when he's graduated from MIT. He's invested in a little better camera than his Kodak's Box Brownie that he had in college. There are some 19-teens pictures that are in the scrapbooks, and they're really, really grainy. They're rough because it's a college kid. He bought his own camera. Now he's got a full-time job. And this is a great shot. It's one of my favorite of his early 20s pictures of an inspection train leaving Harrisburg, Pennsylvania on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And what's interesting about this is normally, if you look at an inspection train today, the train is very nice, very well apportioned, has what we call a theater car, where you've got literally movie theater style seating and a giant glass window, and it looks backwards so you can see where you've been. And generally, the railroad executives sit there, and some poor superintendent for the division is sitting there praying, please don't ask me a question. Please don't ask me a question. But in this case, the Pennsylvania Railroad in the 20s did it the other way. The inspection car is on the front of the train. They've got this giant headlight. And there's no glass. So if you're doing this in the summer, I hope you're wearing goggles, and you're probably going to want to have some napkins because of bugs in your teeth. But this is a winter trip. It looks like everybody's fairly well bundled up. There's plenty of steam coming off the locomotives. But it's just a great, great example of something that didn't get photographed a whole lot, particularly by someone in the industry. And Barriger gets away with it because he's a management trainee. And this was a theme. He would go around as a management trainee on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he took lots of pictures of things that he was exposed to as a trainee. He had to go to Broad Street in Philadelphia after the fire that destroyed the train shed during the 1920s. That used to be all enclosed. That went up overnight. It was a massive fire. That helped spell the end of Broad Street Station. If you've ever been to Philadelphia today, they have a nice new Art Deco 30th Street station from the 30s that Amtrak has since restored and is marvelous. That was one of the impetuses for, or one of the reasons that Pensy went and spent the money on that new structure. Broad Street went up in flames. And he did take pictures of unique events. Given that we're in college football season and it's November and Army Navy is about a month away, he did occasionally go out and take a picture of the operation of the Army Navy trains that would go to Philadelphia, which from a logistical standpoint and from a management standpoint, that's something that they wanted to expose anybody to. You've got to bring thousands and thousands of people from areas with limited railroad infrastructure. Annapolis, Maryland, and West Point, New York only have one railroad in and out of those two locations. You've got to bring the entire midshipman corps, the Corps of Cadets from West Point, and get them to Philadelphia, play a football game, get them all home before Sunday. And then you've got all the fans that are going to show up. So it became an all hands on deck situation, and was quite interesting. And if you do want to take a look at these later on, they're all on our Flickr page. So you're more than welcome to enjoy those. Whoops, wrong one. Now, it's not to say he didn't take pictures that were not of just people. He did, let me make sure I'm sharing this too. There we go. Whoops. He did take time while he was on the Pensy to photograph people working. And this is a fun shot because he went with some of his friends. This is in Chicago. This guy is running a switch engine in the freight yards for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Chicago. And Barriger's a management trainee, so he works for the company. And so he's got fairly free reign. They're not going to tell him no, because technically he outranks this engineer as management. But he would, on occasion, pal around like this and look at these wonderful people working on the railroad. Now, the great thing, though, is one of his friends also brought their camera. So this is one of the few cases we have of a picture of Mr. Barriger taking the picture and gave Mr. Barriger a print of this. So you get to see how the photo came to be. Now, when he's a young man, these are just going into a file that he's keeping. He's just working for the Pennsylvania Railroad. That's all he's concerned about at the moment. And it's nothing unmanageable. In 1929, he decides he's going to leave the Pennsylvania Railroad and he's going to go to Wall Street. Part of it was he had I think, an internal schedule he wanted to run of where he wanted to be. And Pennsylvania was a fairly straight-laced, strict command structure of management. And he was in a hurry. So Barriger decided to leave. He went to Kuhn Loeb and Company right as the market was about to crash in 1929. But he was looking at railroad securities for them. And that winds up getting him to the attention of a guy named Frederick Prince. Throughout the teens and 20s, the railroad industry was dealing with the effects of all the overbuilding they had done after the Civil War, which is an entire topic on its own. But essentially, we had way more capacity than freight and passenger traffic levels merited. And a railroad track is a piece of sunk cost. You have to maintain that all the time. And generally, that's also been paid for with a bond, which has an interest payment that has to be paid all the time, or you get into big trouble. So Barriger's looking at this, and Prince is looking for someone to help him analyze the financials of the railroads. And Barriger gets tapped and starts working with him on this railroad consolidation plan, which ironically, if you look at how railroad consolidation worked in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, it followed the plan that Prince and Barriger and his teams put together pretty well based on the economics. What's happened now is we've gone a couple steps further. So now we're going to be down to 6 railroads in North America that are considered big if the CP merger goes through with Kansas City Southern. But that experience also gets him to the attention of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation during the Great Depression. And that is the reason we have these massive, massive scrapbooks. So let me switch cameras here. And I'm going to ask Sarah if she can come up and help with this, because we're going to start looking at the scrapbooks proper and talk about what we're seeing. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation came about actually during the Herbert Hoover administration, right when the Depression started. And it was a means to get credit to businesses. If you think about what happened with the housing crisis about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the credit market froze. And with the Great Depression, the same thing happened. And the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was going to be a bank for businesses. And Barriger got brought on for the railroad division to analyze these applications for credit. Now, keeping with his practice of documenting what he did from a technical standpoint and being interested in civil infrastructure, That's what a lot of these railroads are asking for money for. We want to rebuild the infra. We had World War I. The railroad network has been just run ragged. They're trying to reinvest in new track, new equipment, new locomotives, new signals, new communication systems. And the credit market has just dried up. So the RFC gets brought in to be that bank. And Barriger gets tasked with examining these loan applications. They only turned down one railroad throughout his tenure. It was the Colorado Midland. And the reason they turned it down is because it was a completely redundant railroad line. It did not need to exist. There was no justification to keep it going. But I'm going to start, since we're in St. Louis, I'm going to start with the home team. Missouri Pacific was one of the early beneficiaries of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. In fact, it received the single largest loan of the RFC. With the RFC, they asked for $44 million to keep Missouri Pacific solvent. What had happened is Missouri Pacific and several other railroads had become part of a syndicate run by two brothers in Cleveland named the Van Sweringens. And they had built their syndicate off of the security value of other railroads that they used to buy more railroads. And that's fine when the securities increase in value consistently, but October 1929 changed that math. So now they're in deep trouble, and MOPAC's in dire need of cash just to make payroll. So they got a single check of $44 million from the RFC. It was the largest check the RFC ever wrote during its program. It wasn't the largest single amount of money loaned to a company, but it was the largest single check they wrote. I think, unfortunately, my railroad, the B&O, got most of the money because we were in worse shape than they were. But Barriger goes out and he inspects all the railroads as they apply. His mindset is, okay, so you're asking for a loan. It's like if you're asking for a refinancing loan for your house or a loan for the car. One, do you need the money? Two, if I give you the money, what are you going to spend it on? I mean, is it going to go for executive bonuses? Or are you really going to rebuild the track like you're applying for? Two, does the track really need to be rebuilt, or is this cover for some other project? And three, if I give you the money, can you pay us back? Because this is not a gift, this is a loan. So he spends a lot of time on the Missouri Pacific. In fact, here he is at Kirkwood. It helps that his mother is still living in St. Louis, his younger brother is still living in St. Louis, and his sister is still living in St. Louis. So he would be on these business trains and go around, and there'd be a railroad executive, at least a vice president with him, and they would be telling them about where they're going to spend the money. So Barriger would be there, some other people from the RFC would be there, and they're going over the loan application as they're in the back of a business car. And occasionally he would stand out on the back platform and start taking pictures, which is great. For us, because he's taking pictures of the infrastructure. Here's Kirkwood, Missouri. I'm sure many people have used this Amtrak station before. Let me go ahead and turn the light out just a little bit so we get some better. And Sarah, you can, we're going to go ahead and turn the page. And he would go through all of these communities, and he's taking pictures of the railroad infrastructure. There we go. Okay. He was taking clippings of all of the scenarios situations he was dealing with, and he's getting pasted into the scrapbooks. So really, the scrapbooks are not just an invaluable record of the photographic situation we're seeing, or photographic record of the situations we're seeing. He's putting it all in context in the scrapbooks, particularly in the 1930s. So the Van Sweringen network, they're trying to save this whole complex of these various railroads. There were about a half dozen railroads involved with the Van Sweringen system, and they are all deeply wounded by the collapse of the stock market. So Barriger is keeping very close watch on what's going on. And he does take pictures of other pieces of infrastructure. That's along the Missouri River, along in the Jefferson City area. And I mean, the Missouri Pacific stuff, there's still pages and pages of photographs, the whole system that he's photographing and documenting here. And, you know, not to let people think that he's only focused on the big railroads. If you were a little railroad, this is the Missouri Southern. This was a lead mining operation in the southern part of Missouri. It asked for RFC money. And it got it because, you know, it was producing raw materials desperately needed for the economic recovery. One of the big projects he did wind up getting involved with that was not a, we've got to save the company project, was called the Dotsera Cut Off. I don't know how many folks have ridden the Zephyr out of Chicago to Sacramento. The Rio Grande portion that you go over, the historic Rio Grande west of Denver. Rio Grande used to have a massive amount of infrastructure in Colorado that was expensive to operate because you've got, you know, mountains and not many places that are really good to build railroads. So you had to make engineering compromises. The Dotsera Cut Off was going to be a way to cut off a lot of mileage and elevation changes between Denver and Salt Lake City and make the Denver and Rio Grande and the Western Pacific a more attractive link between the Midwest and the West Coast. The problem was it was an unholy expensive project to build. And the only way they could get it built was either massive amounts of private capital or an RFC loan. And they got an RFC loan because the RFC looked at the project and said, this is economically beneficial to the whole country. And I would not be honest if there weren't some people at the RFC who were already looking at what was happening in Europe and saying, and in Asia with Japanese rearmament and industrialization, and say, you know, we've got to keep pace long term. Barriger goes out and he kept extensive records of the Denver and Rio Grande. Now, I'm going to add, he did go out and have some fun. This is on what is today called the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. And for those of you who really like winter, I highly recommend going to the Cumbres and Toltec area during winter. They have a rotary snowplow, which they have both for historic purposes and for practical use. That is the rotary snowplow when it was part of the railroad organically, and it was currently in use that day. This was January 29th of 1933. Barriger is out in that area looking at the Denver and Rio Grande. Rio Grande is interesting as it was one of the few railroads in the United States that kept narrow gauge operation into the 20th century. And it's there are two significant pieces that still exist as narrow gauge. They're both tourist lines, the Cumbres and Toltec and the Durango and Silverton. And also most of the equipment in terms of the locomotives and the rotary snowplow that they just restored are authentic to those railroads. But Barriger was there in the winter of 33. I got to have a feeling this was mostly fun as opposed to work, even though he was looking at the RFC loan for the Rio Grande, and the Rio Grande was legitimately a basket case as well. Early on, I mean, if you don't have to shovel it, it's really fun to watch. So we've got these pictures in the collection. We go to the next one. We're going to start looking at the cutoff itself. Now, this was a pretty massive project for the Denver and Rio Grande, and it also brought in a second railroad called the Denver and Salt Lake. Those railroads are going to eventually end up merging later on. And shockingly, each one wanted to be in charge of the cutoff. So a lot of the argument became, well, we're paying for this part, so this should be our responsibility, and we should control who operates on this part of the railroad. Barriger at this point doesn't care about that. The RFC just wants it finished. So he goes out. I mean, this track isn't done yet. They're literally putting in bridge beams in, and he's going out and photographing it because one, it is such a massively expensive project. Two, for him, it's extremely interesting on a personal level. As a civil engineering grad from MIT, this was pretty amazing that they're doing this. And it was a point also where he made a lifelong friend from a young executive on the Rio Grande, who wound up becoming his boss. As any New York Central fans, Al Pearlman started on the Denver and Rio Grande, and he winds up becoming president of the New York Central, and in 1957 hires Barriger to become president of the PNLE. But they met in the 30s when a very young Al Pearlman was working out west. We can go to the next one. They decided they were going to have a big, massive party. And they brought the Zephyr from Chicago, which was like, in 1969, flying a Boeing 747 straight from Everett, Washington to wherever your event was going to be. We can go to the next one after that. And it was a big, big party. And normally he didn't blow up a lot of his pictures, but in this case he did. Yeah. Now there's 2 points on the Dotsera Cut Off. There's Dotsera and Arrestad, which is Dotsera spelled backwards. And at Dotsera, they had this big party with people from the feds. There's a caption. There's 2 prints of this in the scrapbooks. So the first one, this is the blown up version. You've got the speaker's platform on the right, and on the left, he points out that that's the barbecue at the lower left for everybody who was attending. And so June 16th of 1934, I think that's right. Yeah, was when that project was finished. And it cut about 11 miles of travel and a lot of curvature off of those of travel between Denver and Salt Lake. And it winds up setting up the merger for the Denver and Salt Lake and the Denver and Rio Grande, which needed to happen anyway for the system to work. But that was probably one of his most, looking at the scrapbooks, it was one of Barriger's most proud achievements to be involved with that project, even if it was just helping get the financing. It is the only single project that he ever was involved with that has its own photo album. It takes up most of what we used to call album 6. And it shows that his passion for engineering really kind of consumed him with this one. And it was a significant amount of railroad construction. I would say it was probably the largest single railroad construction project for new track in the 1930s that came about from the RFC. But it was very, very impressive. Now we're going to go back to one other, just to make sure that we do cover both coasts. And also, I'm a little biased. The B&O got a lot of money from the RFC. The reason we have the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historic Park is because the B&O used that as collateral for an RFC loan, one of its many RFC loans. And to pay off that loan, they just gave the property of the old Chesapeake and Ohio Canal from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland. They gave that to the federal government. That was how they paid off one of their loans. It's in the spirit of paying off the loan, but it was not the full value of the loan. But I think the Roosevelt administration just was like, okay. He was, for the most part, operating out of DC, so he spent a lot of time there on the B&O. And one project that the B&O did that actually makes its way to St. Louis is the Lord Baltimore, which was going to be their lightweight, innovative, very British-looking steam locomotive that winds up getting sent to the Alton Railroad and runs between St. Louis and Chicago with the Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, the train set behind the steam locomotive is the Abraham Lincoln train set that will go with it to the Alton and run between here and Chicago for many, many years. It was built here in St. Louis by American Car and Foundry. It was a lightweight train. Now, I say lightweight, it's still a heavy train car, but it was designed with lighter materials, aluminum, as opposed to heavy, thick stainless steel. The idea being it improved operating efficiency because the locomotive didn't have to work as hard, so it wasn't using as much fuel. Unfortunately, you have to have very, very, very good track for that to be an enjoyable ride. And unfortunately for the B&O, they did not spend that kind of money on their track. And it became apparent after the passenger complaints for, you're going to have to pay to clean this suit that I spilled coffee on while riding your train, that they had to, this was not going to work on this piece of railroad. So they moved it west. They moved the whole thing, the locomotive, the lightweight cars. There was a companion locomotive to this called the Lady Baltimore. That also came to the Alton Railroad. And that train set ran until the GM&O days, when the GM&O took over in the 40s. So we'll go to the next picture. Now, most of these are also in black and white. Barriger spent most of his time photographing in black and white. And just to show you how bad the B&O was, you know, this is the clip. This is one of the clipping pages of how bad the B&O finances were. So the loan was legitimate. And Barriger, you know, he's keeping track of all of this. If you wanted all of these articles, you would have to dig through the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Baltimore Sun and Fortune magazine. And here in the scrapbooks, Barriger has pulled every little bit of information that was relevant to his decision-making process and the RFC's decision-making process, and he's keeping track of all of it. Part of it also is his reputation is on the line, because he was the examiner. They went with the loan based on his recommendation. And if the loan goes bad, he doesn't have enough friends in the Roosevelt administration to keep his job. We'll say that. Jesse Jones won't lose his job, who's Barriger's boss. But Barriger's going to look pretty bad. So he's keeping an active eye on all of this. And we go to the next one. Now, one big thing that's going to wind up, here's another shot. As 1940, he's still with the RFC. And things have started to settle down. And you can see this is at Chicago in November. And we've got about a year of peace left before things really start to change. Barriger knows things are winding down at the RFC. And you start to see in the scrapbooks, 40s, they stopped changing from these desperation loans to keep everything going to a lot more project-based loans. And I'm going to switch to sharing my screen now. One of the last projects he worked on before war broke out was with the Illinois Central, and it's literally called the Lakefront Railroad situation in Chicago. All those wonderful parks along the lakefront, where the Bean is and the Art Institute is. That used to be a massive, massive freight yard. And you've probably seen in the Library of Congress Jack Delano photographs of this same scene. But this is Randolph Street. You've got suburban trains carrying commuters in and out of Chicago, and you've got all of these freight trains. And if there has been one constant since railroads were built in the city of Chicago, is that immediately, how do we fix the problem of trains in Chicago? I have a feeling that if I go back to 1840 to the very first railroad being built, which became the Northwestern, the Galena and Chicago Union, the second report is, how do we fix the railroad problem in Chicago? This was part of a 2-volume study that Barriger put together in November and early December of 41, where they were looking at spending RFC money with the Illinois Central, which was financially pretty stable during the Great Depression. But they needed a lot of cash if they were going to fix this problem of fixing the lakefront railroad situation in Chicago. There's the Art Institute. If you go there today, you know, there's parts of the galleries you can look out the window and watch the commuter trains going by underneath the museum. But it's massive. And all this track was getting in the way of development. You couldn't build any more capacity on the lakefront yard. The Corps of Engineers was not going to sign off on moving the shoreline out further into Lake Michigan. It was too expensive to build west because you'd have to start tearing down parts of downtown Chicago, and that just was not going to happen. So it became a question of where are we going to move all of this freight infrastructure out? We've got to keep the passenger stuff in. And Barriger goes through and tours this area for months on and off with Illinois Central, City of Chicago, State of Illinois professionals, transportation consultants. They're trying to figure out what are we going to do. It all goes onto the back burner on December 7th of 1941. And at that point, Barriger moves from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to the Office of Defense Transportation. And he gets a couple of jobs. And at that point, his photography goes on hiatus for most of World War II, partially because he's so busy. And he also winds up working in areas outside of looking at railroad infrastructure. He goes to work at ODT, and one of his first jobs is to look at the railroads of Puerto Rico because of the sugar industry, which is a valuable wartime commodity. And so this is actually the album he put together for his report. He spends early 1942 in Puerto Rico photographing the railroad infrastructure there and looking at how to make sure that it's going to meet the needs of the food industry here in the United States to produce enough sugar and move that off the island safely. Interesting story. While he's in Puerto Rico, here in the US, in Peoria, Illinois, the Toledo, Peoria, and Western, a relatively small railroad, but a strategically important one that links the Western railroads, particularly the Santa Fe, with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and does not go through Chicago, and thus is not part of the Chicago Railroad problem. They have been undergoing a long-term strike. And the Roosevelt administration, once the war breaks out, using this piece of railroad saves 3 days of going through Chicago. And the administration now is like, okay, guys, we need this ended now. And the unions won't budge and the management won't budge. Management ownership won't budge. Roosevelt offers federal mediation. The owner of the railroad sends a collect telegram to the White House telling him to mind his own business. At which point Roosevelt decides, okay, I'm taking the railroad. And Barriger's in Puerto Rico, and he gets a call from his boss at Office of Defense Transportation and says, John, I need you to get on a plane and fly to Chicago. You're running the Toledo, Peoria, and Western, and you've got to get the strike taken care of. This was one of the best things that could have happened to Mr. Barriger, because if he'd stayed in Puerto Rico and taken the ship home that he was going to take home, it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Everybody survived, but I'm pretty sure nobody really needed that excitement as part of their day. But Barriger got to avoid that, and he went to Chicago. He was authorized 100 U.S. Army soldiers from Fort Sheridan. And when he went there, and it's in his diary, which is in the collection, he talks about doing this. He goes to the commander of the fort, and he's already got the orders from the War Department, and he's like, I got 100 guys who are ready to bust some heads. And he's thinking this is going to be like the old days of union busting. And Barriger's like, let's go and see what's going on. Barriger knows what the root cause of the strike is. It's the unions want the same deal that every other railroad wants. The ownership wants a deal that honestly is what railroads are operating under today. You work 8 hours. If you finish your long train trip of 100 miles, you can work in the yard and switch your train, but you're going to work 8 hours. The unions are, well, if we do our one trip for the day, we're done. And if it takes 6 hours, we still get paid for the full day. If it takes 8 hours, we get paid for the full day. That's the big point of contention. So Barriger goes up and goes to the unions and talks to the union leadership of Peoria and says, what do you want? They reiterate that. He's like, you got it. And within the next day, the TP&W was up and running again. Ownership wasn't very happy. And in fact, they sue and get the railroad back in December of 1945. But Barriger spends the second half of 1942 basically running a little railroad, and he gets a taste for it. So that kind of is the beginning of his career as a railroad president. He'll go to Fairbanks Morse. He'll go to the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. He'll work at the Rock Island. He'll take over and run the Katy in the 60s and then finish out at the Boston and Maine. But his very first railroad presidency, for lack of a better term, was being the operating manager at the Toledo, Peoria, and Western, which he did take a few pictures of, not many, because it was during the war. And even during the war, photography of trains was not encouraged. So there are a couple little grab shots of troop trains on the TP&W after he took over. And the photography kind of goes dormant for a lot of the 1940s until he starts working in the industry again. Very little of the collection is in color. He doesn't switch over to color until the late 60s. I think more of that is it became harder and harder to find black and white film, and he got a new camera, which was set up for color film. So about 1964, 65, you start seeing pictures in the scrapbooks in color. I did not bring any of those up. Honestly, so much of the good stuff, in my opinion, is the 1930s, where literally it's the entire railroad infrastructure of the United States that it's really worth looking at. But if you do want to see them, we have them online. We have many of the scrapbooks downstairs. We do prefer, if you do come to look at them, to make an appointment in advance. Honestly, because of the condition, I would really prefer, as a curator who's concerned about their survival, and I think my colleagues would agree, if you can use the digital copy rather than the hard copy in this case. And when you come up here and see them, you'll see why we would like it. But they are well loved. They are wonderful pieces. They are wonderful time capsules. For those of you who are here in person, you have an opportunity to take a look at them. For those of you who are here virtually, if you want to see the photographs, you can go to our Flickr page. Awesome. We've arranged them by railroad. And this originally started out as just Barriger photographs, but we've added his son Stanley. We've added other collections. We've added our collection of Milwaukee Road Company photographs, construction of the DL&W station in Scranton that John found from the Franklin Institute. No, we bought these. The Franklin Institute, the Lakeshore Michigan Southern Engineering photographs from the late 19th century are marvelous. So what started as a Barriger nucleus, much like the library itself, has expanded on our Flickr page. So we really encourage folks, please enjoy them. And as we scan more things, this gets expanded. So I've hit about 50 minutes. So we'll yes.
Is there a historical pattern to overuse of the railroads and undersupply of the ability of the railroads to serve the public? Is there a pattern such as with wars or with because you referred a couple of times to periods of overcapacity.
Right.
What caused that?
A lot of it was financial speculation in the late 19th century, where for lack of a better term, the robber barons, Gould, Fisk, Drew, Harriman, some of it was personality. I'm not going to let this other person win. And so we're going to build another railroad. And that doesn't slow down until 1907 when JP Morgan shows up, because the House of Morgan backs the bonds for most of these companies. And that's when the period of new railroad construction really slows down in this country. And they finally say, let's rationalize the railroad network as it stands. And for the most part, the capacity was fine. And it was fine for the general level of traffic. The only real big hiccup we ever hit was World War I, when the ports just froze on the East Coast, and that just created a backlog throughout the entire network. Literally, like if you have a hose and you stop up one end of the hose, that pressure pushed the rest of this, went through the whole rest of the United States railroad network. And that was not great until winter started to set in and coal shipments needed to start going into the northern ports, not for export, but for heating and cooling of the citizens in those cities. And at that point, the situation was bad enough and the railroads were not able to unravel it, that the US Railroad Administration got formed. So Barriger got to see that happen while he was in college at MIT and doing his co-op with the Pensy. And one thing, if you see in any of his speeches to other people in the industry, is we cannot let this happen again, because when the feds were finished with the railroads, they were in very rough shape. And we had to spend a lot more money than we were given in compensation to fix it. It hurt the industry in public perception, it hurt the industry with the government, and it hurt their bottom line. So Barriger's, it's very interesting. He becomes a student of Andrew Cassatt, who was, we need to police ourselves so that people don't do it for us, because if we don't do it, we're not going to have any control over how decisions are made. Yeah.
Was not the president of the TP&W assassinated as part of that labor dispute?
After the war was over, yes. When he got his railroad back, he immediately reinstituted the old arrangement of 8-hour day. And in 1948, he was walking home from a Bradley College basketball game on a foggy night. A car pulled up next to him, and 2 shotgun blasts resulted in a regime change at the TP&W. And the FBI never was able to figure out who did that. And interesting enough, Jack Barriger was rooming with the nephew of the owner of the railroad when that happened. Oh, yeah, at MIT. So it was very close to home in the family.
Another question?
Yeah.
Can you talk about the cameras a little bit?
Yeah. Originally, he had a Kodak Brownie when he was in college, and if you look at the early stuff, it looks very much like stuff out of a Kodak Brownie. Yeah. He had a camera. His first good camera, and most of what this stuff was photographed on in the early 30s was stolen. So he was in Union Station in Chicago. He had the camera case on top of his luggage. He went to get a porter. He came back, and the camera was gone. So after the 1940s stuff, and you can see how the format changes. It goes from a 3x4 format to a 3x5 format, or 4x5 format. And we have the second camera downstairs. I did not bring it up because honestly, I didn't have the space where felt I could display it safely. And also, really, I don't think folks at home could have enjoyed it. But it was I think it's a Hasselblad. It is a European camera. And it's not the really, really nice one, but it was a very good camera for its day. He spent on it. He spent money to make sure he had quality equipment with him.
Anybody else?
Well, just a quick one. Expanding a little bit on that, his wartime experience, running that railroad. You mentioned troop transport. Were there also supplies and?
Yeah.
I mean, how did the government use that railroad?
Well, the government did not take over the railroads, but instead they set up an office in the Pentagon for defense coordination. And any military train got a specific number, and all the railroads had representatives with this office, and they took care of the routing. It was secret, but everybody who needed to know where this train needed to, Fort Ord, California to Norfolk, whatever. For private supplies that were going to industry, that was partially managed by just what industries could get what supplies. All the defense industries had high priority, and certain commodities were given a higher priority on trains than others. And that was an indirect control over how trains were being routed. The closest freight commodity that had old style USRA control was oil. And that was heavily managed by the federal government as getting oil from the Gulf Coast to the refineries in the East Coast, particularly once the Germans started sinking all of our tanker ships. So, yeah.
Did he himself put together these scrapbooks?
He had two secretaries that put these scrapbooks together. And he was there with them. And for the most part, his memory was good enough that, the captions are very, very good. There are a couple of spots where we put things on Flickr and put the caption up. People said, I'm not sure that's right.
Those real things.
But for the most part, these are very, very good captions.
I think his sister Betty worked on them a bit too.
And would,
Cleaned
yeah,
them up as well
Yeah.
at home.
yes, because this was all done at the St. Louis house
Right.
off of Union. And then he also would do these sketches of railroad interlockings, particularly where they were complicated, to help you get oriented with what the picture was showing, with whose railroad is on what track. Yes, sir.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
I
the
wonder if-
indulgence.
Because of my inexperience with this, with the technique of using Flickr,
Mhm.
are we offering, as part of this presentation, a tie-in to Flickr that you just click on and it
Yep, Brittany put a link out to our virtual attendees.
link? That's the
Mhm.
word I'm looking
Yep.
for.
And if you go to our homepage, it will take you to our Flickr page.
Nick, how many people have taken advantage of this since you mounted it?
Well, let's take a
It's a
look.
number I can't ever remember because it's so large.
Let's see what the number is today, because I logged in. 7.69 million views.
Wow.
76.
Or sorry, 76.9. Sorry. I misplaced the decimal. One nice thing about, big data is you can see how things are doing on a daily basis.
Brittany, are there any questions in the chat?
I have no questions in the chat.
Well, one last question here. Well, thank you again, Nick.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody.
Pictures are truly a work of art, and there would have been a time 50, 60 years ago when the pictures would have been restored in a collection like this, and a scrapbook possibly thrown away. The Mercantile always looked on them as objects that people put together. The Thomas scrapbook of the mayor of St. Louis in the Civil War, we use that all the time. We keep this in the reference room. It's been used constantly, like the city directories, and it's a great index for the photographic collection, all those Brownie pictures and all of that. They pretty sharp pictures, but that plus this as an art object now, we're so glad that we have it. You can see sometimes in the black paper, they would take the white ink and make curved, almost illustrative descriptions, in almost a typographic way. And it's beautiful to see that. Well, this is kind of our bridge, we're working our anniversary bit by bit as we go towards the final gala in April in the spring. And we're so glad that people have participated with this online and here at the library. The docents have doing great tours, and the curators have done these wonderful presentations, and we're so proud of that. We're not done yet this fall. We have a large showcase, print dealer showcase and silent auction coming up on November 19th. And yeah, I think that's the right date. And I just hope that as many of you can attend as possible, because we're really looking forward to that. Nick, all the curators will be there. And I can't thank you enough for really helping us celebrate this 175th anniversary in so many ways. So, and there's plenty of refreshments here. So thanks a lot.